Well, happy for another opportunity to study with you today in the book of Acts. We're studying in Acts chapter 22 and verse 18, I believe is where we left off last time. Before we begin our study in the book, we want to prepare our minds by going to our Heavenly Father in prayer. We'll ask Brother Dallas to direct our minds. All right, we've been studying about Paul's address, where he's been a riot in the temple because of false accusations made about Paul defiling the temple, which he hadn't done, and he's been rescued by the Roman commander there in the fort of Antonia that was in charge at the temple to keep order. They've rescued Paul, brought him up to the steps of the castle there, and he asked for permission to address the crowd. And, of course, the commander doesn't know what he did. He tried to ask Paul and ask the crowd, and he didn't get an answer. Some people said one thing and some another. He really doesn't know what the problem is, so he let Paul address the audience. But when Paul began to speak, he spoke in Hebrew. So he spoke in a language probably this commander couldn't understand. And Paul tried to explain to the people why it was he became a Christian, that he was to be just like them, and his attitudes towards the law of Moses, and he had even persecuted Christians, but he saw the Lord on the road and in the light, and he was appointed to be an apostle, and he's telling about his conversion to Christ, that he was baptized for the forgiveness of his sins, and then after he had finished his work in Damascus and Arabia, he had come back to Jerusalem. And he was trying to preach during that 15 days to the Jews that were there. And he fell into a trance. And it was a divine trance that was given to him where the Lord revealed to him he needed to get out of town. That the Jewish people there were not going to receive his testimony of the gospel. It came about that when I returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance. And I saw him saying to me, "Make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me." So as much as it may sound logical that here the chief leader of the opposition to the church has been converted and completely changed his point of view because of something that he's learned, and now he's working to promote the gospel that he used to try to tear down, that people knew how sincere and zealous he was before, that surely they would accept his testimony when he came back and told them why he changed. But the Lord knows better human nature, I guess, than we do. He says, they're not going to accept you here. They look at Paul as a traitor, right? He is a turncoat or whatever. They're not going to give him a hearing. He's not going to get a chance. So you need to go. I have useful work for you, other places to do. His purpose is to go to the Gentiles and preach the gospel to them. So Paul tries to argue with the Lord here. It says, I said, Lord, they themselves understand that in one synagogue after another I used to imprison and beat those who believed in thee. And when the blood of thy servant Stephen was being shed, I also was standing by, approving and watching out for the cloaks of those who were slaying him. They know my background. They know how conscientiously and zealously I used to persecute Christians. So if they ought to, if they ought to listen to anybody, they ought to listen to me when I tell them why I changed. It ought to be an impressive bit of evidence, and you'd hope that it would be. But sometimes party loyalty and all of that just overrides people's reason. And they're not going to listen. The Lord is right. We're going to see the Lord's right. It's going to be proven that they will not listen to Paul, no matter how good he preaches the sermon or, what kind of evidence he gives. He's not a messenger they're willing to listen to. Verse 21, and he said to me, so Jesus answers him, go. So it's a short answer, like, all right, you gave me your reasoning, but I'm telling you, you got to go. No more reasoning about it. Whether you can see it or not, I got other plans for you. Go. Go. You got to leave. I will send you far away to the Gentiles. So he's got a plan out there to preach in all of these Gentile lands. Paul's going to go all through Asia Minor and over into Europe, all the way to Rome. He's going to preach the gospel in many foreign lands, far away from the land of Palestine and the land of Israel there, and going to do great work that all of us are going to be grateful for. It's not going to be in Jerusalem. He's going to be able to be successful. And people listen to him, and you can see the kind of prejudice they have about preaching the gospel and saying Gentiles can be saved in Christ just the same as Jews. And all of these centuries they've been taught, you're my chosen people, Israel. You're the special people. These other nations, I don't have a relationship with like I do you. They had a hard time with the idea the gospel's for everybody. And when Paul mentions Gentiles, they just flip out. What do you mean? The Lord, if there's a Christ and he came, he would say, go preach to Gentiles. They don't want to buy that. They listened to him up to this statement. And then they raised their voices and said, away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live. So the Lord know what he's talking about when he said, hey, Paul, they won't listen to you here. There's a lot of reasons why you'd think they would, but he said they will not listen to you here. And here you see, they'll listen to him until he said Gentiles, and then they just go crazy. And that's the end of any rational thought or listening to anything that Paul has to say. And they demand he be executed right here on the spot. Away with this man. He doesn't deserve to live. He doesn't deserve any chances. The Romans should not have saved him from us. We should have stomped him to death when we had the chance, right? They've been falsely informed about Paul's teaching about the law of Moses, being opposed to Jewish customs and somehow hostile to the law. And Paul is not that. Christianity is not that. Christ is the fulfillment of the old covenant. It is the fulfillment of everything they ever hoped for. It's come to pass with Jesus Christ and the new covenant. It's not something we're trying to destroy everything the old law had to say. No. We have the fulfillment of those things is what Paul is preaching. The hope of Israel has come. But they are prejudiced against this, thinking he's speaking against the law. That's what they've been told. And he just wants to go out there among the Gentiles, and he's sort of, in his account, he's just stating the facts, but when you read his account, doesn't it sound like the Jews are more hard-hearted than the Gentiles? Right? I mean, you could take it that way. If you were listening to it, you would say, what, the Lord doesn't want you to stay here and preach to us? You got to go preach to these foreigners. Well, that's the truth. That is what exactly they would not listen. And maybe the truth hurts sometimes, doesn't it? And sometimes people don't have their hearts pierced and yield to the gospel. Instead, it makes them mad. And that's what happens with these people. They're just mad about it. And we get those two kind of reactions, yes. Excellent point. And Paul does submit, doesn't he? He gets out of town. He goes and does what the Lord tells him to do, and the Lord is proven right. We have similar conversations with Ananias, right? When Ananias was said, I got a man I want you to go preach to. He says, wait a minute, Lord, don't you know this guy's a persecutor? We don't need to go talk to him. And he says, no, he's a chosen vessel, and you go talk to him. And so, same kind of thing. People look at it, and they don't see it as deeply as the Lord sees it. We don't have the understanding of it. And just excellent point. There's many times, you're reading and you think, well, that doesn't sound exactly right or the best way to go. But you put it into practice and you prove it to be the right, excellent way to live, when you follow the Lord's way. Yes. It's a lot like the Lord's teaching about, a prophet is not without honor except in his family or his hometown. Sometimes it works that way. And here it is with Paul. He was one of the leaders, the chief guy, and yet they won't accept him. Now that he's changed, he didn't just think about it, he did it, Absolutely. And let's look at this crowd. It says, and as they were crying out and throwing off their cloaks and tossing dust into the air, the commander ordered him to be brought into the barracks, stating that he should be examined by scourging, so that he might find out the reason why they were shouting against him that way. So you talk about a crowd just going mad, out of control, that they want blood, and throwing dirt up in there, throwing their clothes off, just showing, well, this guy doesn't deserve to live. Crucify. It's just like the scene you saw earlier with the Lord when they were wanting him crucified. A poor commander, he just keeps trying to, what is this about? And at every turn he's thwarted. What's this about? And nobody can give him a straight answer. And Paul preaches and he can't understand the sermon, but whatever Paul said just makes everybody go crazy. And so we'll just take him in, we'll beat it out of him. We'll find out by scourging this guy what kind of criminal he is. We'll make him confess. And so they take him in to tie him up and stretch him out, and then they're going to use this Roman scourge on him. You got an example of it with a wooden stick there. Then you put those leather tongs attached to it with little pieces of bone or metal on the end to tear your skin, and they would whip you with that. I found a quote from Tacitus, the Roman historian. He said when people were scourged in these beatings, he said 7 out of 10 men died from being just the scourging. Jesus was scourged and then led away to be crucified. So you see the kind of punishment he'd already gone through before he got to the cross. And a lot of times those that survived it were crippled or carried off on a stretcher when they got through beating you. Tell us what you did. Whack, whack. It wasn't some rubber hose that wouldn't leave any marks. It's a scourge that's going to tear your skin open. And so they've got this all figured out. We'll just find out what this man did by beating it out of him. In verses 25 and 26, and when they stretched him out with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned? And when the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and told him, saying, what are you about to do? For this man is a Roman. So this plan's not going to work either, because you can't treat a Roman citizen like this. So we're just going to beat it out of you. The Roman citizen, they had rights as a Roman, just like American citizens are supposed to have rights that protect us from unreasonable treatment and so on until we have a trial. And idea you're going to torture somebody into a confession, that's not for a Roman citizen. So this is what I can just imagine, they're strapping him up there, and Paul says, hey, you think this is a good idea to beat a Roman citizen? Whoa, what? We thought you were some Egyptian, terrorist that had come down here. We didn't know you were a Roman. So he runs, he's shocked. He runs and tells the commander, the centurion, that he's got 10 of these centurions, over 100 men each that are under him. He's in charge to make sure the beating's carried out right. And he runs in and tells the commander there of the whole fortress, what are you doing? If we beat a Roman citizen, we're subject to the same penalty. They're going to scourge us. The Caesar could say, well, you're going to be scourged. We're going to treat you the same way you treated a Roman citizen. So certainly they don't want that to happen. The commander's not going to waste any time finding out about this. It says, and the commander came and said to him, tell me, are you a Roman? And he said, yes. And the commander answered, I acquired this citizenship with a large sum of money. And Paul said, but I was actually born a citizen. So he's still strapped up here, however they got him tied up as this conversation goes on. It was a death penalty if you said you were a Roman and you weren't. So you better be what you say. Are you a Roman? Yes. Says, well, surely a guy like you, I'm sure Paul looked like a pitiful mess. He'd already been kicked and stomped and drugged through the courtyard and everything before the Romans got a hold of him and had to carry him up into the fort. And you look at this guy and say, how much money did you spend to get that? surely you're not a natural-born citizen. And Paul said, yeah, I am. I'm actually, my forefathers got Roman citizenship, and it's been passed down to me. So as far as social rank and all, in the eyes of Romans, he's even higher than the commander as far as being a Roman citizen. He didn't have to pay for it. He was actually born a Roman citizen. So, this is news. It says, therefore, those who were about to examine him immediately let go of him. And the commander also was afraid when he found out that he was a Roman, and because he had put him in chains. So he said, he had already, even binding him, he could get in trouble for that. He was a Roman citizen. He's got his rights. You got to treat him properly with respect. Can't be abusing a Roman citizen that's uncondemned. And so I picture that in my mind, all of those guys that were getting ready to whip up on him, man, and they untied him as fast as they could and let him go. And the commander, he knows he's got to answer to higher ups. He's got to answer to Caesar. And it's nothing for Caesar to sack these guys and make them commit suicide or exile them to a foreign country or something if they don't do what they're supposed to. And so he's afraid himself he shuddered with fear when he thought about what could have happened if he'd have gone on with this scourging. Verse 30, and on the next day, wishing to know for certain, he's still working at this. I've got to find out, what did this guy do? Can you imagine if you're in his position? This guy caused a riot. And then when he spoke to the people, he caused another riot. What in the world is this all about? I tried to beat it out of him. I couldn't do that. And on the next day, wishing to know for certain why he had been accused by the Jews, he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the council to assemble and brought him down and set him before them. So we'll go down, we'll let the Supreme Court of the Jews bring their charges, and I'll find out now what the deal is. If nothing else, at least I'll know what to charge him with. I know what to write to the governor about if I have to. What is this man accused of? So we got now the Sanhedrin assembled. This is the same group we've been studying about in Matthew and in the life of Christ that tried Jesus. This is what this is about, I think, 58 or so. So 28 years later. A lot of the faces would be changed, wouldn't they? It wouldn't be the same guys sitting there. Some of them might be the same, but a lot of the faces would be different. But it's the same court. Different high priest, but of the same character as the ones that tried Jesus and arrested the apostles and tried to get them not to preach the gospel. So that's who he's standing before here. So in chapter 23, you continue on with the story with Paul's address to, he doesn't get far, but he stands before the court, and of course it's a kangaroo court, right? I mean, Jesus did not get a fair trial. He said, if I answer, you won't respond, right? Isn't that what the Lord told the same council? So it doesn't matter what I say. You're going to crucify me anyway, so it doesn't matter if I talk or not. And Paul's going to figure out real quick that's the same thing for him. They're not. And then what do? Every situation isn't the same. All of us need to learn when we're trying to share the gospel or teach. There's some people you have an opportunity with and some people you don't. And you need to recognize the difference when you see it. This is not a time for debate. This is a time to get out of town, right? I need to just escape the situation to be able to preach to somebody else. And that's what Paul's going to do. He's going to blow this whole thing up so that he gets away and they don't all get together and put him to death. So it's another story in psychology here, I guess. It says, Paul, looking intently at the council, said, "Brethren, I have lived my life with a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day." So Paul starts his address. Does that sound anything bad about that? He said, I've always tried to keep a good conscience in everything I do. When I was a Jew, I always did that because I thought it was right. When I persecuted the church, I thought that was right. And I was doing it all out. He was all out Saul. And now that I'm a Christian, I'm still living by a good conscience. I always try to do the thing my conscience approves of. I don't violate my conscience and do things that I feel guilty for. So that's what you'd want everybody to live that way, right? That's what everybody should do. Now you want to make sure you educate your conscience to where it knows what's really right. But all of us have to keep a good conscience no matter who we are. That's a good quality in anybody, that they at least are honest in trying to do what they think's right. That's what the conscience is for. And so Paul says, I always try to do what's right. One thing you learn from this, is, of course, it's been used in thousands of sermons over the last 2,000 years, is that the conscience alone is not a safe guide in religion as far as what's right and wrong. It does tell whether you're honest or not, but it doesn't tell whether you got the right facts or not. And Paul was mistaken about Jesus Christ. What he was doing conscientiously in persecuting the church made him the chief of sinners. He was fighting against God, and he didn't realize it. He did it honestly, but he really didn't get it. He didn't see the truth. But once he saw the truth, he changed. And we need to be people that always keep a good conscience, but always try to continue to educate ourselves and make sure our conscience is operating on the right information. Because just like Paul, we can be deceived. We can think we're right when we're actually wrong. So anyway, there's a lot of things to think about in that passage there and about Paul. But he was an honest person. You can see why Paul would be picked out. If you were going to pick out a Jewish persecutor, and I'm going to make this guy an apostle, at least he's honest, right? The Lord picked out somebody that would do what he thought was right. So I can work with this guy. If I give him the right information, he's going to be a great servant for me. Right. I don't see a problem. I think that sounds perfectly fine. But if you think this guy is your enemy, and he's against your religion and all, and he gets up and says, I'm operating with a perfectly good conscience, they do take it as an insult. But it's wrong. Is that what you should do in court? You know, under the law of Moses, you weren't supposed to treat people like this. The guy starts talking, and he's opening line. He says, I'm trying to do what I think is right. Slap him on the mouth, that bum. What kind of a fair trial are you going to get with these guys? Right there you go, no matter what I say, I'm cooked, right? I got to get out of here. That's Paul. That's in Paul's mind by now, I'm sure. Right? It's amazing how. And again, if you're this Roman centurion, commander standing here watching this clown show, you're thinking, what is the matter with these people? These religious fanatics, that they're all going crazy. It says the high priest Ananias commanded those standing beside him to strike him on the mouth. So I've lived with a good conscience. Whack. Well, I don't think I'm getting a fair hearing. Do you? It's like, this is not going well. First thing out of your mouth. Well, Ananias was a real character, just like these other high priests. A towering example of hypocrisy is what Josephus tells us. He lived back there at that time, and he tells about these corrupt high priests that were ruling at that time. And a lot of people in society mocked them because they were so corrupt and greedy and everything, running the country. So it was a shame that they were, just like Jesus said, they're like sheep without a shepherd. They don't have anybody over them that they can look up to. So he was put in to be the high priest in 48 A.D., and then he got accused of abusing Samaritans and got sent to Rome and had to stand trial there, and Claudius cleared him, and he just got back, and here he is treating Paul this way. So he hadn't changed in his character at all. And he's such a thief, he eventually gets kicked out of office. And when the rebellion happens, the zealots chase him into an inner room and kill him. So Paul said, God's going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. And isn't the Holy Spirit with Paul when he's standing trial? That's what it says, right? Jesus promised, you don't have to study your defense or anything. It'll be given to you what to say. And so he says, you're a whitewashed wall and God's going to strike you. God did strike him. He was not very many years later, he is hunted down and put to death. So He shouldn't have acted so unfairly in this trial, and he shouldn't have treated the Lord's apostle this way. Slap him on the mouth for opening his mouth. And so in 67, he's going to be put to death. So his days are coming. That's about, 9 years later? He doesn't have much longer. He's going to be able to carry on this routine. Absolutely. Yeah. And it doesn't go well for people when they persecute the church. What happened to Herod, when he beheaded James? It wasn't very long. He was eaten with worms and died. Right? I mean, the Lord's going to strike you. You better get ready. You might have the power of darkness on your side right now at this moment. But so Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. And do you set to try me according to the law and violate the law, and in violation of the law order me to be struck? It says, here you are, the head of the court, or you're in charge here of one of the Sanhedrin members. You're supposed to judge people by what the law teaches. And it teaches people have rights. You don't just slap people because they try to defend themselves. That's not the way it worked in the Old Testament either. And so he was a whitewashed wall. And that's a phrase that goes back to Jesus also in talking about the woe to the scribes and Pharisees, that they were like whitewashed tombs. You got this tomb full of corruption and uncleanness, and if anybody touches it, they're unclean. That's what they were like, but they painted white. They painted it white, made it look nice and clean and not harmful in any way. It was hypocritical, is to be a whitewashed wall. You look like you're something shiny and good, but inside you're rotten. And that's what he tells this man that orders. I don't know. He says the next verse, he didn't know he was the high priest, or he wouldn't have said what he said if he'd have known that. But what he says is the truth. Whether, you don't not say it to the governor or whatever, or the judge when you're standing before him, but you're corrupting your fellow countrymen, right? Twisting people's minds against the truth. So, again, it says in the Old Testament, it says in Leviticus 19:35, you shall not do unrighteousness in judgment. But that's exactly what he's doing. He's directly violating the law in the way he treats a person that's uncondemned, right? He's innocent until proven guilty. Slap him on the mouth. Well, prove I'm not following a good conscience, first, before you slap me on the mouth. But the bystanders said, do you revile God's high priest? And Paul said, I was not aware, brethren, that he was high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. So, if I'd have known he was the high priest, I didn't know. There's a whole crowd of people sitting here. I guess he's not dressed like a high priest. Paul didn't see maybe where the command came from or whatever, but for whatever reason he says, honestly, I didn't know he was the high priest. If I'd have known he was the high priest, I wouldn't have reproved him in that way. But what he said is absolutely true, and he's sitting there judging Paul unrighteously. That is certainly true. We are to respect those in positions of leadership is what the Bible teaches. You give honor to whom honor is due. If a person is in a high position, you treat them with respect. And that is something the Bible teaches us to do. All right, we'll come back and see how Paul blows this whole thing up, Lord willing, next time.